When the Ertugrul set out, she was an aging ship beset with troubles. She had an important task ahead of her, however. She was to cement ties between the Ottomans and Japan, bringing a diplomatic party on board, as well as gifts from the Sultan to the Emperor of Japan. Though her voyage was full of problems, she would succeed in her mission, only to never make it back to Istanbul again.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the diplomacy of the doomed Ertugrul?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Ertugrul's rudder fell into the sea. Her sternpost entirely destroyed after running aground while passing through Lake Murattul Kubra on July 2nd, 1889. Though she was repaired and able to return to her journey on September 23rd of the same year, her troubles were not over. Soon she began to take on water, and this was not something that could be repaired until she reached Singapore. It would not be until March 22nd, 1890, that she would leave Singapore and start the last leg of her journey to Yokohama, Japan. She arrived there June 17th, 1890, 11 months since she had first set out. But her voyage had been far from an easy one, and it would only become worse for the aging ship once it came time for her to return to Istanbul. The Ertugrul had originally been built in 1863 as a three-masted frigate. But the Ottoman Empire was in the middle of a push to modernize their navy, and in 1864 she had been sent to England to have a steam engine put in and screw machinery installed. The Ottoman navy had fought beside the English in the Crimean War, and had experienced firsthand the power of ships with steam engines and modern guns. Unfortunately, even though the Ottoman Empire had at one time been a center for shipbuilding and gunnery, those days had since faded. They now depended on English machinery and guns to modernize their ships, and they were forced to hire outside experts to teach the crews how to use the steam engines, as well as foreign experts to run the once famous Ottoman shipyards and bring in fresh and modern designs. Even the idea of converting the Ertugrul from a sailing vessel to a steamship was behind the modernized navies of many of the major powers. The Ertugrul was still a wooden ship in an era when more and more ships were being built out of metal. Though it was a step forward, the Ertugrul and the other ships like her that had had steam engines placed in them after production would never bring the Ottoman navy back to its former glory. With a push towards modernization, Sultan Abdul Hamid II could look towards Japan. Japan was making a similar effort, but with more success following the Meiji Restoration, and the Ottomans reached out to the other nation, voicing their hope that the two nations could be friends since they shared similar endeavors and faced similar difficulties. Both nations had found that they were not treated as equals by Western powers that they had signed treaties with, especially England. Though both nations were still forced to depend on England and could not break ties, it surely would be beneficial for both of them if they also stood as friends with one another. Japan seemed to welcome the idea, and sent Prince Komatsu no Miya Akihito in 1887 to Constantinople to establish the initial relationship between the two countries. Since the prince was a close relative to the Japanese emperor and came carrying gifts, the Ottomans could consider this a good sign for their future relationship with Japan. The Sultan granted the prince an audience, and once the delegation from Japan had left, thoughts turned to returning the favor of the visit. The Sultan decided that it would be best to use the most recent graduates of their naval academy as a crew, since it would be a good training mission for them. With the crew decided, next came the matter of the ship to send. The Ertugrul was by no means the most modern ship in the Ottoman Navy at this point. They had several metal-hulled ships that were younger and more dependable, but they had a major setback. All of the modern ships in their navy also had not been built at home, but had instead been bought from England. As this was a trip that was supposed to represent their nation, the Ertugrul seemed like a better choice. Though aging, she had been built by the Ottomans, and bore the name of the father of Osman I, the founder of the empire. As for who would captain the ship, Captain Ali Osman, an experienced naval officer from a family with strong ties to the Navy, was selected. In general, no fault was found with the selection of Captain Osman or with the new graduates as crew for the voyage. But concerns were quickly raised about the Ertugrul. This was going to be a long voyage, and it was well known that the Ertugrul was not in the best of condition. The Ministry of Marine was asked to have the ship checked over and to report to the government on her condition, but they never responded to the letter. They did refit her hull, but they did not fix or replace her boilers, something that caused the ship's chief engineer to be dismissed from his post. An Englishman, the chief engineer perhaps had fewer reasons to care about the national pride of sending an Ottoman-built ship on the mission, and he submitted a report expressing that her boilers were old, her engines insufficient, and her top speed was only 9 knots. In his opinion, he felt that she was not suited to the task they had given her. Rather than thank him for his honest opinion, the engineer was fired. So it was that the Ertugrul set out on her voyage. A couple of months behind schedule, with a crew over 600, though the exact number is stated differently by different sources. The telegraphs that were received by the Ottomans from the ship were not hopeful ones for the mission. The ship was full of rats, the ship had lost its sternpost, the ship had sprung a leak, and with every update, the idea of sending the Ertugrul all the way to Japan was once more called into question. At one point, it was suggested that it might be best for Captain Osman to take a different ship entirely along with a couple of his officers, and leave the Ertugrul somewhere with its crew to get it repaired. The messages that were received back from the Ertugrul, however, stated that she could still sail, and they would be able to complete repairs and be on their way. While her crew was fixing her in Singapore, Captain Osman was promoted to Rear Admiral and given the title of Pasha. The ship would remain in Singapore through the winter due to the winds not being favorable for them to head to Japan. Though the Ertugrul had steam engines, her hold only had enough coal for 100 hours of travel, meaning that she was going to have to depend mainly on her sails to travel the large remaining distance between Singapore and Japan. Though the spring brought more favorable winds, the ship was still forced to purchase coal in China, an unexpected expense since rough seas had caused her to burn coal more quickly than expected. Their arrival in Japan must have seemed a welcome respite to the crew of the Ertugrul when they arrived. Osman Pasha was welcomed by the Japanese emperor at his palace in Tokyo, and he was able to present the emperor with the gifts from the Sultan. In exchange, Osman Pasha and the officers with him were given a feast in their honor. The British and French also had warships in the harbor at the time, and the crews exchanged visits, held boat races, and were generally able to relax as they were welcomed by the Japanese citizens. Unfortunately, this welcome also would bring misfortune. Japan was suffering from a cholera epidemic, which soon found its way on board the Ertugrul. In total, 37 of the men on board would get sick, and 13 would die of the sickness. Among those who died was the man who was charged with keeping the account of the voyage of the Ertugrul, the poet Ali Ruhi Bey. With the outbreak of the disease came another misfortune for the ship. They were forced to quarantine for the following 33 days. Osman Pasha was ordered to start his return journey in September, something that was welcomed by the ship's officers. Due to the delays during their voyage to Japan, they worried that both the money and their food supplies would run out if they waited any longer. Japan had some reservations about their proposed departure, however. September is the height of typhoon season, and the Ertugrul had not been refitted after her difficult journey, and was an old ship. It was argued by their hosts that it would be best for them to wait a couple of months before they began their voyage. Osman Pasha was determined, however, and the Ertugrul began its return trip in good weather on September 15, 1890. The initial day of good weather proved to be deceptive. By the next morning, there were signs of an approaching storm, and by that night it became clear that they were in the middle of one of the typhoons they had been warned about. The sails were being taken in when the mizzenmast began to collapse. The officers and men rushed to prevent any further damage to the rest of the rigging of the ship, and though they managed to plug the hole created by the mizzenmast, their troubles were only just beginning. The pounding waves had separated the deck boards at the front of the ship, allowing water to begin to flood the coal area of the boiler room. Though it was now the middle of the night, the men ran around the ship with lanterns, trying to patch and caulk the holes that were forming and letting the water in. Others were put on the duty of trying to reinforce the remaining masts and sails. The fight against the rising water was the fiercest battle, and though men were on the pumps, it became clear that the pumps were not able to keep up with the water that was rushing in, and men grabbed buckets and began to bail out the boiler room, since it was well known how important it was for boilers to be safe. By September 18th, it became clear that the only hope for the ship was the prospect of finding safe harbor in Kobe. Her crew had not had a chance to eat, drink, or rest as they battled against the elements. The ship was within 10 miles from the Kahinozaki Cape of Oshima Island. They could see the Kahinozaki lighthouse in the distance when the water reached the furnaces and the engines stopped. Though just past Kahinozaki Point was relative safety, without their engines the cape was more a sign of danger with its rocky outcrops than it was a welcome sign of safer waters to come. The sails were unusable, and without any way of steering clear from the rocks, the ship was doomed. The men in the engine room, in water up to their chests, desperately tried to get the steam engine up again. Then there was a tremor, and it was grimly announced that the water that had come in had caused one of the furnaces to collapse. It was now rolling back and forth, hitting the sides of the ship as it pitched in the storm. Osman Pasha and some of the other officers rushed to the engine room to find a solution, while cavalry officer Ali Bey tried to buy them some time the best that he could by ordering the anchor be dropped until they could steer away from the rocks. He was too late. Before the order could be obeyed, there was a crash. The ship had struck the rocks on the eastern edge of Oshima Island. The aging and battered Ertugrul disintegrated on impact, with only the poop deck remaining above water. Out of the over 600 men on board, only 69 were able to reach the shore, and none of them were senior officers who reportedly made no effort to leave the doomed ship. Osman Pasha, Cavalry Officer Ali Bey, and many of their men would never leave the Ertugrul. Those who did survive were found by the keepers of the Kashinozaki lighthouse, which was only alerted to the wreck by the people pulling themselves onto the beach. The storm was so loud and powerful that it had hid the horrors of the sinking ship completely from the lighthouse. Despite the storm, the residents of Kashinozaki and Oshima rushed to the area once they were alerted, and did what they could to pull men from the ocean. Out of the survivors of the shipwreck, only 6 of the men were fine, while 9 were heavily wounded. They were fed, clothed, and housed by the local villagers until German and Japanese ships were able to bring them to Kobe. Meanwhile, the villages of Kashinozaki and Oshima searched for the dead. Only 150 bodies were recovered from the disaster, but these were given a burial near the Kashinozaki lighthouse. The Ottomans would later send 3,000 yen to be distributed between the residents of Kashinozaki and Oshima. The Japanese government took great care with the survivors of the wreck. They put doctors at their disposal, made meals tailored to their tastes, and provided them with a translator until they could be returned to the Ottoman Empire. In October, once the danger of further typhoons had passed, the 2 Japanese frigates, the Hei and Kongo, set out to return the survivors to Istanbul. They arrived on January 2, 1891, bringing the condolences of the Meiji Emperor and his government to the Ottomans. With them came Yamada Torajiro, the first resident Japanese merchant in Istanbul, as well as their unofficial emissary. In the same year, a monument was built by Japan in Oshima, where the dead had been buried, known as the Martyrs' Monument. In 1937, Turkey paid to have it restored. The Ertugrul had not been forgotten, however, especially between Turkey and Japan, where the doomed ship became a permanent bridge between their 2 nations and a symbol of their goodwill towards each other. In 2015, the first film to be co-produced by Turkish and Japanese directors had its premiere. Its name was Ertugrul 1890, released 125 years after the ship sank beneath the waves. Pieces of the Ertugrul have found their way back into the public eye through archaeological efforts started in 2008. Involving teams from Spain, Turkey, and Japan, items from the wreck were carefully brought up, many of them personal items of the men who lived on the ship for over a year, as well as items that had probably been intended as gifts from Japan to the Sultan that never reached their destination. Also to be brought to the surface have been fragments of human bone. These fragments, it was agreed, were not to be considered items of archaeology. Instead, they were buried with the other remains at the monument in Oshima, with an Islamic burial ceremony by an imam from Tokyo and the Turkish military attaché in Japan present. Also present were Japanese dignitaries, highlighting the importance that the wreck continues to have for both nations. For more information, please see The Ottoman Steam Navy 1828 through 1923 by Bernd Langensiepen and Ahmet Güleryüz, and translated by James Cooper, or see our sources listed in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.